update on his cancer journey as he met with patients at a hospital opening in Birmingham. Europe correspondent Edward Godfrey reports the monarch also joked about getting old.
Moments ago, Princess Catherine broke down on live television and revealed the devastating truth about King Charles that the palace has been hiding for weeks. What she said about his health has left doctors stunned and the entire royal family in absolute chaos. They tried to silence her. They begged her not to speak. But what she just exposed about the king's real condition is something they can never take back. The departure was anything but ordinary.
It has been an incredibly tough couple of months for our entire family, but I've had a fantastic medical team who have taken great care of me, for which I'm so grateful. In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous.
Within minutes of the motorcade's exit, entire wings of the palace were placed under lockdown. Lights that hadn't been switched on since Queen Elizabeth's passing suddenly illuminated forgotten corridors. Senior staff members, typically known for their composed and methodical approach to even the most challenging situations, were seen moving through the halls with visible urgency. Their faces, usually trained to reveal nothing, betrayed a deep concern that something fundamental had shifted. What made this night particularly alarming was the complete absence of official communication. There was no carefully worded statement from the press office, no health bulletin wrapped in the formal language the palace typically employs during moments of crisis. The silence itself became a form of communication, one that suggested this was not a planned event, but rather something that had caught even those closest to the king off guard. Palace insiders would later describe the atmosphere as one of controlled panic. Encrypted phone calls began bouncing between senior advisors and trusted courtiers within minutes of the departure. Each conversation carried an increasing sense of urgency, with some speaking in coded language, while others whispered about containment strategies and final instructions. It was as though a carefully rehearsed emergency protocol had been activated, one designed for a scenario the public was never meant to witness. The first tangible sign that something was seriously wrong came when the official royal calendar underwent dramatic changes. Scheduled appearances, speeches, and formal audiences that had been planned for weeks simply vanished from the public record within an hour of the departure. Those who regularly monitor the royal family's official website noticed the sudden deletions and immediately began capturing screenshots, adding fuel to what would soon become a firestorm of speculation. Reports emerged that royal physicians had been seen rushing through private corridors shortly before the motorcade left the palace grounds. This detail sparked immediate theories about a potential medical emergency. However, the secrecy surrounding the departure raised troubling questions. If this were truly a health crisis requiring urgent attention, why would the palace respond with lockdowns and silence, rather than the usual carefully managed medical bulletins? The contradiction between the apparent urgency and the complete lack of transparency suggested something far more complex was at play. The first public alarm came not from official channels or mainstream media, but from ordinary citizens who happened to be watching the palace grounds that night. A small group of dedicated royal watchers who regularly live-stream the area noticed the unusual activity. Their hurried social media posts, describing the convoy of vehicles and the suspicious timing, spread rapidly across platforms. One observer simply wrote that something was happening at Buckingham, while another posted a phrase that would soon dominate headlines around the world: "The king is gone." Within hours, the international media descended on the palace gates. Camera crews from dozens of countries set up positions, all demanding answers that were not forthcoming. News anchors struggled to fill airtime with meaningful information when official sources remained completely silent. The vacuum of information created space for speculation, and theories began to multiply with each passing hour. For an institution built on tradition and carefully managed public relations, the lack of response was particularly striking. The monarchy had weathered numerous storms throughout its long history, from scandals and divorces to deaths and public relations disasters. But this situation felt fundamentally different. Previous crises, no matter how challenging, had always been met with some form of official response, even if that response was carefully calibrated to reveal as little as possible. This complete silence suggested that those within the palace were either unable or unwilling to address what had happened. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, which had long served as symbols of continuity and unchanging tradition, now seemed to pulse with uncertainty. Staff members were reportedly given strict instructions not to speak about the night's events, even among themselves. Letters were sealed in unusual haste, meetings were canceled without explanation, and a single directive spread through the palace staff like a cold wind: maintain absolute silence. As dawn broke over London, it became increasingly clear that this was not simply a temporary retreat or a brief departure for personal reasons. The scale of the response, the level of secrecy, and the dramatic changes to official schedules all pointed to something far more significant. This was not a monarch taking a short break from public duties. This was a departure that carried with it implications for the entire royal family, and potentially for the constitutional framework that had governed Britain for generations. The timing of the departure only added to the sense of crisis. There had been no public indication that anything was amiss in the days leading up to that night. King Charles had appeared at official functions, fulfilled his duties, and given no obvious sign that he was preparing to take such a dramatic step. The suddenness of it all left not just the public, but apparently even senior members of the royal household scrambling to understand what had happened and why. When Prince William finally appeared before the assembled press corps, the weight of the moment was immediately apparent. His usual composure, the carefully maintained royal bearing that had been instilled in him from childhood, showed visible cracks. He gripped the podium with both hands, not as a gesture of authority, but as though steadying himself against an overwhelming tide. This was not the confident air the public had grown accustomed to seeing at state functions and official ceremonies. This was a son confronting a reality he had not anticipated. His voice, when he began to speak, carried an unfamiliar tremor. The carefully prepared remarks that palace communications staff had drafted were abandoned almost immediately. Instead, William spoke with raw honesty about a situation that had blindsided him and his family. He described his father's decision as one that none of them had been prepared for, a phrase that landed with particular impact given its source. If the direct heir to the throne had been kept uninformed about such a momentous decision, it raised profound questions about what had really transpired behind palace walls. The tone of William's statement shifted between disbelief and barely controlled anger. At several points, he paused for long moments, and these silences became as meaningful as his words. Analysts would later replay these pauses repeatedly, examining them for hidden meanings and unspoken emotions. Was he fighting back tears? Was he carefully choosing his next words to avoid revealing too much? Or was he simply struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened? The statement William made included a particularly striking phrase that would be dissected endlessly in the hours and days that followed. He spoke of external forces that had left his father with no choice, a carefully worded hint that suggested the king's departure was not entirely voluntary. This was an extraordinary admission from someone in William's position. Members of the royal family rarely acknowledge internal conflicts or suggest that decisions are made under duress. For the heir to the throne, to publicly imply that his father had been pressured or coerced represented a dramatic break from royal protocol. Media outlets around the world immediately seized upon this revelation. Commentators and royal experts began analyzing every word of William's brief address, searching for clues about what these external forces might be. Some speculated about political pressures from government officials concerned about the direction of the monarchy. Others suggested internal palace dynamics, with powerful advisors or family members potentially playing a role in pushing Charles toward this decision. Still others wondered whether financial considerations or institutional concerns about the future of the monarchy had created an impossible situation for the king. The public response to William's emotional delivery was intense and immediate. Social media platforms erupted with discussion, debate, and speculation. Hashtags related to the royal crisis began trending globally within minutes. The careful image management that typically surrounds royal announcements had completely broken down. Instead of a controlled narrative flowing from palace communications to respectful media coverage, there was chaos, confusion, and a rapidly spreading sense that the public was only seeing a small fraction of the full story. Behind the scenes, palace staff were struggling to regain control of the situation. William's unscripted remarks had not been part of the approved communication strategy. The press office had prepared a more cautious statement, one designed to acknowledge the situation, while revealing as little as possible about the circumstances surrounding it. But William's decision to speak from the heart, rather than from a prepared text, had opened doors that would prove impossible to close. As the world tried to process the implications of Charles's departure and William's shocking admission, attention began to turn toward another figure who had been conspicuously absent from all official communications. Queen Camilla, who had spent years carefully building her position within the royal family, had seemingly vanished overnight. Her name, which typically appeared on multiple royal schedules and official announcements, was suddenly nowhere to be found. The disappearance was not subtle. Every planned engagement Camilla had scheduled over the coming weeks was abruptly canceled. There were no explanations offered, no postponement notices issued, simply blank spaces where her commitments used to appear. For someone who had worked so hard to establish herself as a working member of the royal family, this sudden erasure from the official calendar was deeply unusual and immediately suspicious. Inside the palace, even more troubling signs began to emerge. Staff arriving for work in the days following Charles's departure noticed that several portraits of Camilla had been quietly removed from their usual positions in select corridors. In royal tradition, the placement and removal of portraits carries significant meaning. These are not simply decorative choices, but deliberate statements about status, favor, and position within the family hierarchy. The removal of Camilla's images suggested a dramatic shift in her standing. The Queen Consort's most trusted advisors, individuals who had worked closely with her for years and were known for their absolute discretion and loyalty, found themselves suddenly reassigned. Some were moved to distant departments with minimal responsibilities. Others were placed on what was described as indefinite leave. These were not routine administrative adjustments. They represented a systematic dismantling of Camilla's support network within the palace structure. Leaks from palace insiders, speaking on condition of anonymity, painted an even more concerning picture. Multiple sources claimed that Camilla had been completely excluded from all high-level crisis meetings held since the night of Charles's departure. Her name did not appear on any internal guest list for strategy sessions. Her advisors were not invited to participate in discussions about how to manage the unfolding crisis. For someone who had spent years positioning herself at the center of royal decision-making, this exclusion was not just unusual. It was a form of exile happening in real time. The British tabloid press, never shy about pursuing royal stories, approached the mystery of Camilla's disappearance with particular intensity. Front-page headlines speculated wildly about what might have caused such a dramatic fall from grace. Some publications suggested she had been involved in secret disagreements with Charles that had contributed to his decision to leave. Others painted scenarios in which she had attempted to manipulate the succession process, only to be discovered and sidelined by other family members. Each theory seemed as plausible as the next, and with no official statement from Camilla herself or from palace representatives on her behalf, the speculation only intensified. Public reaction to Camilla's absence split along predictable lines. She had always been a polarizing figure, someone who inspired strong feelings both positive and negative. Those who had never accepted her role in the royal family viewed her disappearance as a form of justice, a long overdue reckoning for someone they believed had never truly belonged in the position she held. Supporters, meanwhile, expressed concern about what appeared to be a coordinated effort to erase her from royal life without explanation or due process. Social media became a battleground of competing narratives. Hashtags demanding to know Camilla's whereabouts trended alongside others celebrating her apparent downfall. The palace's continued silence on the matter only made the situation more volatile. Every day without clarification brought new theories, new accusations, and new demands for transparency. While Camilla remained mysteriously absent, and William struggled to manage the public narrative, another member of the royal family was preparing to break her silence in a way that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the crisis. Princess Anne, known throughout her life for her dedication to duty and her preference for staying out of dramatic public disputes, had reached a breaking point. Anne had always occupied a unique position within the royal family. She was not in the direct line of succession, which gave her a certain freedom from the intense scrutiny faced by those closer to the throne. She had built a reputation as the hardest-working royal, someone who quietly fulfilled hundreds of engagements each year without seeking attention or praise. Her approach to royal duty was straightforward and unpretentious, focused on the work itself rather than the pageantry surrounding it. But the events of recent days had pushed Anne beyond her usual reluctance to engage in public controversy. As she watched her brother disappear under mysterious circumstances, as she witnessed the chaos engulfing the palace, and as she saw the monarchy's credibility crumbling under the weight of unanswered questions, she made a decision that would shock the nation. When Anne finally stepped forward to make a public statement, it was clear immediately that this would be unlike anything the British public had heard from her before. The palace press team, still reeling from William's unscripted remarks, tried to manage the situation. But Anne insisted on addressing the public directly and without the usual layers of official review and approval. Her statement was delivered with a combination of quiet strength and barely contained fury. She began by speaking about duty, a concept that had guided her entire life and one she held sacred above all else. But then her tone shifted, and she began to speak about betrayal. Not in vague terms or with diplomatic language, but directly and forcefully. She accused unnamed forces within and around the palace of deliberately working to destabilize her brother's reign. Anne's choice not to name specific individuals made her accusations even more powerful. Everyone listening understood that she was speaking about people within the royal circle itself, not outside critics or political opponents. She described a pattern of manipulation and ambition that had placed personal interests above loyalty to the crown and to family. It was a damning indictment, made all the more credible by the source. The implications of Anne's statement were staggering. For the first time, someone within the inner circle of the royal family was publicly suggesting that Charles had not simply chosen to walk away from his duties. She was indicating that he had been pushed, pressured, and ultimately forced into a position where departure seemed like the only viable option. This was not the narrative of a dignified transition that the palace had been attempting to construct. This was an allegation of internal treachery at the highest levels of the British monarchy. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. News organizations that had been struggling to piece together the story from fragments and speculations suddenly had a senior royal openly confirming that something deeply troubling had occurred behind palace walls. Front pages the next morning carried headlines describing Anne as the conscience of the monarchy, the lone figure willing to speak truth in a moment when others chose silence, or carefully managed messaging. Television news programs devoted hours to analyzing her statement, with experts examining every phrase and implication. Constitutional scholars appeared alongside royal biographers, psychologists, and political commentators, all attempting to understand the full significance of what Anne had revealed. The careful analysis revealed layers of meaning in her words. When she spoke of those who place ambition above loyalty, she was clearly referencing specific individuals. When she mentioned deliberate destabilization, she was describing a coordinated effort, not random events or misunderstandings. What struck many observers most powerfully was the personal pain evident beneath Anne's controlled delivery. Those who had followed her career knew that she rarely revealed emotion in public settings. Her approach to royal duty had always emphasized action over sentiment, work over spectacle. But in this moment, her voice carried an unmistakable current of heartbreak. This was not just a constitutional crisis for her. It was a deeply personal betrayal of someone she cared about. The relationship between Anne and Charles had always been complex, but grounded in mutual respect. They were siblings who had grown up in the intense pressure of royal life, who understood better than anyone else the unique burdens that came with their positions. To see her brother driven from the throne under circumstances she clearly viewed as unjust and dishonorable was, for Anne, an attack not just on the monarchy, but on her family. Public response to Anne's courage was remarkable. Within hours of her statement, crowds began gathering outside royal residences, holding banners expressing support for her stance. Social media, which had been fragmented in its reactions to the crisis, suddenly found common ground. People who disagreed about many aspects of the monarchy united in praising Anne's willingness to speak difficult truths. She became, almost overnight, a symbol of integrity in an institution that many had come to view with cynicism. The impact on public discourse was profound. Before Anne's statement, the crisis had been primarily about confusion and speculation. Afterward, it became about accountability and truth. Her words gave permission for others to ask harder questions, to demand more complete answers, and to reject the careful non-explanations that had been offered so far. The monarchy's traditional strategy of managing crises through controlled information and patient waiting for public attention to move elsewhere was no longer viable. As Britain struggled to absorb the implications of Anne's revelations, the collective mood began shifting from grief to something sharper and more volatile. What had begun as a nation in mourning over the unexpected departure of its king was transforming into a country demanding answers about what had really happened and who bore responsibility. Candlelight vigils that had sprung up across the country in the immediate aftermath of Charles's departure took on a different character. People were no longer simply expressing sorrow. They were expressing anger, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. The signs and banners that appeared at these gatherings reflected this shift, with messages demanding transparency and accountability, replacing earlier expressions of support and sympathy. The monarchy had always positioned itself as the stable center of British national life, an institution that transcended political divisions and provided continuity across generations. But that image was crumbling rapidly, each day without satisfactory answers, each new revelation that contradicted previous assurances. Each visible sign of internal conflict eroded public confidence further. The careful construction of royal mystique, which had been maintained through centuries of tradition and protocol, was being dismantled in real time. Social media platforms became focal points for organizing public pressure on the palace. Hashtags demanding truth and transparency trended not just nationally, but globally, as people around the world watched the crisis unfold. Digital activism, which had occasionally targeted specific royal policies or behaviors in the past, now coalesced around a demand for fundamental accountability. The palace could no longer control the narrative through traditional media relationships and carefully timed announcements. The conversation had moved beyond their reach. Journalists began conducting deeper investigations into the timeline of events leading up to Charles's departure. Inconsistencies emerged in official accounts. Meetings that were said to have occurred on certain dates did not align with other documented schedules. Advisors who were supposedly present at key discussions were, according to travel records and other evidence, actually elsewhere at the relevant times. It appeared as though two parallel versions of reality were being presented, one for public consumption and another that reflected what had actually happened. Historical comparisons became inevitable. The abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII chose to give up the throne rather than abandon his relationship with Wallis Simpson, was invoked repeatedly. But commentators noted crucial differences. Edward's departure, whatever its other complications, had been his own choice made for personal reasons and communicated relatively openly. Charles's exit carried all the hallmarks of something far more coercive and far less voluntary, wrapped in layers of secrecy that suggested institutional rather than personal motivations. Constitutional experts were quietly summoned to meetings in Whitehall, the center of British government. While the monarchy technically operates independently of direct government control, The constitutional implications of a disputed or unclear succession could not be ignored by elected officials. Legal scholars were asked to review scenarios that had not been seriously contemplated since the previous abdication crisis. The possibility that the entire transition of power might be called into question was no longer theoretical speculation, but a practical concern requiring preparation. For ordinary citizens, however, the crisis was less about constitutional theory and more about fundamental trust. Generations of British people had grown up accepting that whatever scandals or difficulties the royal family faced, the institution itself would endure as a source of national continuity and identity. That assumption was now in serious doubt. The revelation that senior figures within the palace had apparently conspired to force out a sitting monarch suggested that the institution was far more fragile and far more susceptible to internal politics than anyone had realized. The transformation of public mourning into public anger manifested in increasingly pointed demonstrations. People gathered outside palace gates holding not just candles, but signs demanding specific answers to specific questions. The tone shifted from respectful grief to assertive demand for accountability. This was not a revolutionary moment in any traditional sense, but it was a clear indication that the automatic deference the monarchy had long enjoyed could no longer be taken for granted. Into this volatile atmosphere, William and Catherine had been attempting to project an image of stability and continuity. Their public appearances in the days following Charles's departure had been carefully choreographed to suggest that despite the crisis, the monarchy would continue to function effectively. They attended memorial services, greeted well-wishers, and delivered speeches that emphasized unity and looking forward rather than dwelling on recent upheavals.